Hey guys, tonight we're stepping aboard a medieval ship, and trust me, you're about to discover why our ancestors were either incredibly brave or completely insane. Picture this. You're standing on a rickety wooden dock in some fog-shrouded port, watching a vessel that looks like it was assembled by someone who learned carpentry from a children's picture book. The ship creaks ominously even while tied to the pier, its hull stained with salt, tar, and substances you'd rather not identify. You probably won't survive this, and that's before you even leave the harbor. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing our little global community of insomniacs and history nerds come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The gangplank beneath your feet feels about as sturdy as a politician's promise, flexing and groaning with each step. You're clutching a small bundle of possessions, everything you own in the world, because this isn't a pleasure cruise. This is 1347, and you're either a merchant seeking fortune, a pilgrim chasing salvation, or someone running from something terrible enough to make a medieval ship seem like the safer option. The first thing that hits you isn't the spray of salt water or the sight of billowing sails, it's the smell. Imagine taking every unpleasant odor you've ever encountered, mixing them in a blender with fish guts and human desperation, then letting that cocktail ferment in the sun for about 6 months. That's what greets your nostrils as you step aboard. The combination of unwashed bodies, rotting food, stagnant bilge water, and what the crew politely calls night soil creates an aromatic assault so powerful it makes you question every life choice that led you here. The deck beneath your feet is slippery with a combination of seawater, grease, and substances you're desperately trying not to think about. Medieval ships didn't exactly prioritize cleanliness. They were floating survival pods designed to get cargo and people from point A to point B, assuming point B wasn't the bottom of the ocean. The wood is scarred and weathered, with gaps between planks that let you glimpse the dark water below. Every surface is sticky to the touch, coated with a layer of salt, tar, and the accumulated grime of countless previous voyages. Your fellow passengers are a motley collection of humanity that would make a modern airport security line look like a fashion magazine spread. There's the merchant with his nervous laugh and constantly shifting eyes, clutching a purse that everyone pretends not to notice. The group of pilgrims mumbling prayers in languages you can't identify, their faces already green with seasickness and you haven't even left port. A handful of what might generously be called adventurers, but look more like people who've burned bridges in every major European city. And then there's you, trying to blend in while internally screaming about your life choices. The crew members scurry about with the practiced efficiency of people who know that a single mistake could kill everyone aboard. They're dressed in whatever clothing hasn't completely rotted off their bodies, their skin weathered to leather by salt and sun. These men, and they're almost exclusively men, have the hollow-eyed look of people who've seen things that would give Lovecraft nightmares. They speak in a mixture of languages and curse words that would make a modern sailor blush. Their conversations peppered with references to ships that didn't make it home and crew members who went swimming with the fishes. The captain emerges from his cabin like a character from a fever dream. He's got the bearing of someone who's convinced he's in charge while simultaneously terrified that the universe will call his bluff. His clothes are marginally cleaner than the crew's, but that's like saying a slightly polished turd still smells better than a regular turd. He surveys his domain with the expression of someone who's made peace with the high probability that this voyage will end with him feeding the fish. But hey, at least the pay is decent assuming he lives to collect it. The medieval ship you're standing on represents the cutting edge of 14th century technology, which is roughly equivalent to building a skyscraper out of Lincoln logs and expecting it to survive an earthquake. These vessels were typically between 60 and 90 feet long, about the size of a modern tennis court, but they had to accommodate cargo, crew, passengers, livestock, and enough supplies to survive weeks or months at sea. The result was a floating city that felt more like a floating coffin. Historians still argue whether medieval ship captains were selected based on actual nautical skill or just their ability to project confidence while having no idea what they were doing. What we do know is that maritime navigation in the 14th century was roughly equivalent to closing your eyes and throwing darts at a map, then adding a prayer to whatever deity you thought might be listening. The survival rate for long-distance voyages hovered around better than staying in plague-infested Europe, but not by much. As you stand there taking in your new temporary home, you notice the ship's construction with growing horror. The hull is held together with iron nails that are already showing signs of rust, wooden pegs that have seen better centuries, and what appears to be hope and prayer. The sails above you are patched with so many different fabrics they look like a medieval quilt project gone wrong. Ropes hang everywhere like a spider web designed by someone with serious trust issues, and you can't shake the feeling that touching the wrong one might cause the entire ship to come apart like a house of cards in a hurricane. The rigging stretches above you in a complex maze of hemp rope and canvas that would challenge a modern engineer. Each line has a specific purpose, and God help you if you touch the wrong one at the wrong time. The crew members navigate this aerial obstacle course with the casual confidence of people who've learned that hesitation equals death. They scramble up the rigging like caffeinated monkeys, their bare feet finding purchase on ropes that look ready to snap at any moment. Water barrels are lashed to the deck like they're planning an escape, and judging by the green scum visible on their surfaces, you're beginning to suspect that fresh water is a relative term. Medieval sailors knew that fresh water would go bad within days of leaving port, so they often loaded their ships with small beer or wine instead. Yes, you read that right medieval sailors were essentially drunk for the entire voyage, which might explain why they thought sailing across unknown oceans in wooden boxes was a good idea. The food supplies are secured under canvas that's seen better decades, and even from a distance, you can see evidence that the local rat population has discovered this floating buffet and decided to make it their permanent address. These rats aren't just passengers theory, an integral part of the medieval maritime ecosystem. They eat the spoiled food, which is most of it, provide emergency protein when times get really desperate, and serve as an early warning system for sinking ships. When the rats start abandoning ship, you know you're in serious trouble. Speaking of livestock, you notice several chickens pecking around the deck in small coops, their feathers already looking bedraggled from the salt spray. These birds are worth their weight in gold literally because fresh eggs and meat are luxuries that most medieval sailors only dream about. There's also what appears to be a goat tied to the mast, chewing contentedly on a piece of rope and looking remarkably unconcerned about its maritime situation. This goat is probably more experienced at sea travel than you are, which is both impressive and deeply disturbing. Your fellow passengers are starting to look seasick, and the ship hasn't even left the dock yet. The pilgrims have intensified their praying. The merchant is checking his purse for the 15th time, and the adventurers are sharing a bottle of something that smells like it could strip paint. The seasickness is just beginning. Medieval medicine had no understanding of motion sickness, so the accepted treatment was usually pray harder and try not to die. You notice a peculiar character lurking near the stern, the ship's cook, if you can call him that. He's stirring a large pot with what appears to be a boat or adding ingredients that you sincerely hope are just very unusual spices. Medieval ship cooks were notorious for their creative interpretations of edible, and many sailors considered food poisoning just another occupational hazard, right up there with drowning and scurvy. The ship's carpenter is making his rounds, checking the hull with the expression of someone who's trying to convince himself that the holes are supposed to be there. Medieval shipbuilding was more art than science, and even the best vessels leaked constantly. The carpenter's job was essentially to keep the water coming in slower than the crew could pump it out, a delicate balance that determined whether you reached your destination or became fish food. As you stand there trying to process the reality that this floating disaster is about to be your entire world for the foreseeable future, You notice the ship's religious corn-era small shrine, where someone has placed what appears to be every saint's relic they could get their hands on. Medieval sailors were notoriously superstitious, and for good reason. When your survival depends on wind patterns, weather, and a wooden box held together with tar and optimism, you tend to hedge your bets with higher powers. The crew begins preparing for departure with the enthusiasm of people heading to their own execution but trying to maintain professional standards. Ropes are untied with the casual efficiency of people who've done this dance 100 times before, knowing that each voyage might be their last. Someone starts what might generously be called singing, but sounds more like a cat being slowly strangled. Traditional sea shanties that help coordinate the crew's work while providing the illusion that everything is under control. The captain begins shouting orders in a mixture of languages that suggests either impressive multilingual skills or complete confusion about where he actually is. Medieval ships often carried international crews, which meant that critical safety instructions were frequently lost in translation. Nothing quite like facing a life-threatening emergency while trying to figure out whether schnell means hurry up or duck for cover. As the ship lurches away from the dock with all the grace of a drunk elephant, you grab the nearest solid object, which turns out to be another passenger who's having the same panicked realization you are. The vessel tilts at an angle that seems physically impossible for something that's supposed to stay upright, and you begin to understand why medieval sailors had such a complicated relationship with physics. The dock disappears behind you faster than your confidence in this whole enterprise, and the open ocean stretches ahead like an endless blue nightmare dotted with whitecaps that look suspiciously like tombstones. You're beginning to understand why medieval people had such a complicated relationship with sea travel. On one hand, it was the fastest way to cover long distances and potentially make your fortune. On the other hand, it was essentially volunteering to be trapped in a floating coffin with people you wouldn't trust to watch your goldfish, let alone your life. The adventure is just beginning, and you're already wondering if it's too late to swim back to shore. Spoiler alert. It is. The first order of business after leaving port is finding somewhere to sleep, which sounds simple until you realize that medieval ships were designed by people who apparently believed humans could photosynthesize and didn't need horizontal rest. You make your way below deck, ducking under beams that seem specifically positioned to crack your skull, and discover what the crew laughingly calls passenger accommodations. The ladder leading down is more of a suggestion than actual stairs, a series of wooden rungs that have been worn smooth by countless hands and feet, slick with moisture and whatever substances you're trying not to think about. Each step down takes you further from natural light and deeper into what feels like the bowels of a wooden whale that's having serious digestive issues. The ceiling gets lower with each rung, forcing you into a crouch that your spine immediately protests. The space below deck is darker than a tax collector's soul and roughly half the height you need to stand upright. You're forced into a permanent hunch that makes you look like you're perpetually bowing to the ship's structural incompetence. The wooden beams above your head are adorned with an impressive collection of dents and scrapes, silent testimony to the skulls that have met them in previous encounters. You add your own contribution within the first 5 minutes, producing a crack that echoes through the lower deck like a gunshot. The air down here is so thick you could practically eat a delightful mixture of bilge water, human body odor, and something that might be decomposing but you're trying not to think about it too hard. Medieval ships had no concept of ventilation beyond hope the wind blows the smell away, which works about as well as you'd expect in an enclosed space filled with unwashed humans, livestock, and rotting provisions. The atmosphere has the consistency of soup and roughly the same nutritional value, considering how much organic matter seems to be floating around in it. Your bed turns out to be a hammock that's seen better centuries, strung between 2 posts with rope that looks like it was salvaged from a shipwreck. The fabric is stained with substances that tell 1,000 stories, none of which you want to hear. It's a tapestry of human misery rendered in brown, yellow, and colors that don't have names because they shouldn't exist in nature. The rope holding it up has been spliced and respliced so many times it looks like a maritime friendship bracelet made by someone having a nervous breakdown. Medieval sailors believed that hammocks were superior to beds because they moved with the ship's motion, which is technically true in the same way that being punched in the face is superior to being kicked in the stomach. The theory was sound a suspended bed would rock with the waves rather than fighting against them. The practice, however, was like trying to sleep inside a pendulum designed by someone who'd never actually seen the ocean. You attempt to climb into this swinging death trap and immediately understand why medieval sailors had such impressive core strength. The hammock bucks and sways like an angry horse, depositing you unceremoniously on the deck with a thud that echoes through the ship's hull. Your fellow passengers watch this performance with the weary amusement of people who've already gone through the same humiliating initiation. One of them offers helpful advice like, "Try not to fight it," and "Pretend you're a baby being rocked to sleep," which is about as useful as a chocolate teapot when you're dealing with a fabric contraption that seems determined to launch you across the room. The deck beneath where your hammock hangs is scattered with straw that was probably fresh sometime during the previous century. This straw serves multiple purposes. It absorbs moisture, provides cushioning for passengers who fall out of their hammocks, and hosts a thriving ecosystem of insects that treat your sleeping area like an all-you-can-eat buffet. The straw also helps muffle the sounds of the bilge water sloshing around below, which is simultaneously comforting and terrifying. When you finally manage to stay in the hammock for more than 30 seconds, you discover that sleeping in one while the ship is moving is like trying to nap inside a washing machine during the spin cycle. Every wave sends you swinging in directions that defy several laws of physics, and you spend most of the night gripping the sides with white knuckles, convinced that the next swell will launch you across the compartment like a human cannonball. The hammock has a learning curve steeper than the ship's sides, and that curve involves accepting that you will spend significant portions of the night convinced you're about to die. Not from drowning or shipwreck, but from being strangled by bedding or launched headfirst into a support beam. Medieval sailors developed a sleeping technique that involved wrapping themselves in their hammocks like human burritos, but this requires a level of rope manipulation skill that takes months to master. But the motion sickness is just the beginning of your sleeping problems. Medieval ships were basically floating apartment buildings for rodents, and rats consider hammocks prime real estate. You feel tiny feet scampering across your blanket, which is actually just a piece of canvas that smells like it was used to wrap fish, and realize that you're sharing your bed with creatures that have better sea legs than you do. These aren't just any rats. These are professional maritime rodents with resumes that would impress a modern sailor. They've mastered the art of moving through a ship in heavy seas, navigating the rigging during storms, and identifying which food stores are least likely to be guarded. They look at landlubbers like you with the condescending pity usually reserved for tourists trying to ask for directions in broken Latin. The rats aboard medieval ships weren't just numerous. They were organized. These weren't your garden variety house mice. These were maritime rodents with generations of seafaring experience. They knew which ropes to climb, which stores to raid, and which passengers were most likely to drop food. Some ships carried cats to control the rat population, but smart rats quickly learned that seasick cats were about as threatening as wet paper bags. Ship rats had their own social hierarchy, territorial disputes, and what appeared to be a sophisticated communication system based on squeaks that sounded suspiciously like maritime terminology. The older rats seemed to mentor the younger ones, teaching them important skills like how to avoid the cook's cleaver, and which passengers scream the loudest when you run across their faces at night. Historians still argue whether medieval sailors genuinely believed that killing rats brought bad luck, or if this was just a convenient excuse for not dealing with a problem that would have required burning the entire ship to solve effectively. What we know for certain is that medieval maritime law actually protected ship rats in some jurisdictions, treating them as essential crew members rather than pests. Some captains even assigned names to particularly notable rats, and there are records of ship logs mentioning rats by name alongside human crew members. Sleep is further complicated by your bunkmates, a collection of humanity that makes you nostalgic for the relatively pleasant company of the rats. There's the merchant who snores like a broken accordion, creating a rhythmic rumble that harmonizes discordantly with the ship's creaking. Every few minutes, he produces a sound that suggests his respiratory system is attempting to escape through his nose, which honestly wouldn't be the strangest thing you've witnessed since boarding. The merchant's snoring follows no predictable pattern. Just when you think you've identified the rhythm and can maybe sleep through it, he switches to a completely different tempo that sounds like a dying walrus attempting to sing opera. His sleep-talking involves what appears to be price negotiations with invisible customers, and occasionally he'll shout out numbers that suggest either fantastic profit margins or complete mathematical incompetence. The pilgrim in the hammock next to you has developed a nervous habit of praying out loud in what you think might be Latin but could also be a series of creative curse words. His whispered incantations blend with the ship's nighttime sounds to create an atmosphere that's part monastery, part haunted house, and entirely unsettling. Every time you start to drift off, he launches into another round of desperate negotiations with various saints about the likelihood of surviving until morning. This pilgrim has apparently made promises to every saint in the calendar, and he's keeping them informed of his situation with hourly updates. His prayers include detailed descriptions of the ship's condition, weather reports, and what sounds like a running commentary on your sleeping habits. You begin to suspect that you've become part of his spiritual narrative, cast as either a test of his faith or evidence that God has a twisted sense of humor. Then there's the fellow who's clearly experienced enough sea travel to know what's coming but pessimistic enough to assume it's going to end badly. He spends the night offering unsolicited advice about everything from proper hammock technique to the optimal prayer-to-panic ratio during storms. His running commentary on your sleeping form includes helpful observations like, "You're breathing too loud," and "That's not how you hold onto a hammock during rough weather," and the ever-popular, "I've seen guys like you go overboard their first night out." This maritime pessimist has apparently survived enough voyages to consider himself an expert on everything that can go wrong at sea, and he's eager to share his knowledge whether you want it or not. His advice covers topics ranging from which rats bite and which ones just steal your food, to how to tell when the ship is sinking versus when it's just having a bad day, to the proper technique for saying goodbye to your possessions before they get washed overboard. The temperature below deck fluctuates between tropical rainforest and medieval dungeon, with no apparent pattern or logic. When it's hot, the air becomes so thick and humid that breathing feels like drowning in your own sweat. The wooden hull acts like a greenhouse, trapping heat and moisture until the atmosphere reaches a consistency somewhere between soup and punishment from an angry deity. Your clothes stick to your skin like they've been glued there, and moving feels like swimming through warm honey. When it's cold, the dampness seeps through every layer of clothing you own, creating a bone-deep chill that makes you understand why medieval people were so obsessed with finding warmer climates. The cold isn't just uncomfortable, it's the kind of penetrating cold that makes your bones ache and your teeth chatter uncontrollably. No amount of covering seems to help, because everything below deck is perpetually damp from condensation, leaks, and the general maritime lifestyle. Water constantly drips from somewhere above, possibly condensation, possibly a leak, possibly tears from previous passengers who realized what they'd gotten themselves into. This water lands on you with the precision of a medieval torture device, always finding the exact spot that will cause maximum discomfort. You try to position your hammock to avoid the drips, but they seem to follow you like they're personally offended by your presence. The dripping follows a rhythm that almost lulls you to sleep, then suddenly changes tempo just as you're drifting off. Sometimes it's a gentle patter that sounds almost soothing. Other times it's single drops that land with the impact of small pebbles. The water is usually cold, occasionally warm, and sometimes carries a smell that suggests it's picked up interesting flavors during its journey through the ship's infrastructure. The ship's hull creaks and groans around you with sounds that suggest the vessel is engaged in a heated argument with the ocean about who's going to win this particular battle. Every wave produces a symphony of stressed wood and protesting joints that makes you acutely aware of exactly how thin the barrier is between you and a watery grave. Medieval ships were held together with iron nails, wooden pegs, tar, and optimism, and you can hear each component arguing with the others about structural integrity. The sounds are like a conversation between the ship's various parts, conducted in a language of squeaks, groans, and occasional alarming cracks. The hull talks to the rigging responds to the masts, and the masts seem to be having an ongoing disagreement with the deck about load distribution. You begin to recognize different types of sounds. There's the normal operational creaking versus the something important just broke, crack versus the we might all die groan. Privacy is a concept that medieval ship designers apparently never encountered. Your hammock is approximately 18 inches from your neighbors, which means every snore, every prayer, every nightmare, and every biological function becomes a shared experience. The person next to you develops what sounds like consumption sometime around midnight, producing a cough that suggests his lungs are attempting to exit his body through his throat. This lack of privacy extends beyond just sleeping arrangements. Conversations carry throughout the lower deck, creating an audio environment where everyone's personal business becomes public entertainment. You learn more about your fellow passengers' digestive systems, romantic histories, and religious beliefs than you ever wanted to know. The merchant's sleep-talking reveals his profit margins. The pilgrim's prayers include details about sins you didn't know were possible, and the experienced traveler's advice covers topics that would make a brothel keeper blush. Speaking of biological functions, you quickly discover that medieval ships had a unique approach to basic human needs. The crew has rigged a bucket system that's supposed to serve as a chamber pot, but the bucket slides around the deck with every wave, creating a moving target situation that requires athletic ability you don't possess. The bucket is secured with rope that's just long enough to let it slide the full width of the sleeping area, ensuring maximum entertainment value for your fellow passengers when you attempt to use it. The alternative is waiting until morning and using the ship's official facilities, which you've heard described in terms that make the bucket seem like luxury accommodations. The experienced traveler has shared detailed descriptions of the ship's head, the maritime toilet that involves hanging your posterior over the ocean while praying that you don't fall overboard or get eaten by whatever's swimming below. The sounds of the ship at night are like nothing you've ever experienced. Beyond the constant creaking and groaning, there are the mysterious thumps and crashes that suggest either the cargo is trying to escape or the ship is slowly eating itself from the inside out. Occasionally, you hear what sounds like someone walking around above deck, but the crew assured everyone that night watches were doubled, which means either they're lying or the ship has picked up some uninvited passengers. These nighttime sounds create a soundscape that's part industrial accident, part haunted house, and part nature documentary about dying whales. You hear chains rattling, wood splitting, canvas flapping, and what sounds like someone playing a very sad song on an instrument made of suffering. The experienced traveler explains that these are normal ship sounds, but his definition of normal seems to include noises that would send most people running for the nearest therapist. Around what you estimate to be 3 in the morning, based on your growing desperation and the increasing creativity of the merchant's snoring, a storm begins to brew. The ship's gentle rocking motion transforms into something that feels like being inside a snow globe shaken by an angry giant. Your hammock becomes a pendulum, swinging you from one side of your sleeping space to the other with enough force to make you dizzy just lying still. The storm announces itself gradually, starting with a subtle change in the ship's rhythm that makes the experienced passengers sit up and pay attention. The gentle swells that had been lulling everyone into seasick stupors suddenly become more aggressive, lifting the ship higher and dropping it harder. The water starts hitting the hull with more force, creating sounds like someone throwing buckets of rocks against the side of the ship. Your hammock, which had finally achieved something resembling stability, suddenly becomes a carnival ride designed by someone with a grudge against human comfort. You swing sideways, backward, forward, and in directions that don't have names because they shouldn't be possible on a two-dimensional plane. The rope creaks ominously with each swing, and you begin to suspect that your sleeping arrangement might become airborne if the weather gets any worse. The rats, you notice, seem completely unbothered by the ship's increasingly violent motion. They scamper around the deck below your hammock with the casual confidence of experienced sailors, occasionally stopping to look up at you with what appears to be rodent pity. One particularly bold rat climbs up onto your hammock and sits there staring at you, as if judging your amateur performance in the maritime sleeping arts. This rat has clearly seen this show before. It maintains perfect balance despite the ship's motion, occasionally adjusting its position with tiny movements that demonstrate superior sea legs. The rat's expression, and yes, rats have expressions when you're this desperate for companionship, seems to convey a mixture of amusement and professional disappointment in your technique. By the time dawn breaks, and you only know this because someone above deck starts shouting about it, you've managed perhaps 2 hours of actual sleep, distributed in 15-minute intervals between waves of seasickness, rat encounters, and existential crisis about your life choices. You feel like you've been beaten with a sack of wet rope, which isn't far from the truth considering how much time you spent being tossed around your hammock. The morning light filtering down through gaps in the deck above reveals the full horror of your sleeping environment. What looked merely unpleasant in the darkness is revealed in daylight to be a disaster area that would challenge a professional cleaning crew. The straw on the floor has acquired new stains overnight. The hammocks look like they've been through a battle, and your fellow passengers resemble survivors of something that should probably require medical attention. The other passengers begin stirring with the enthusiasm of people who've survived something they weren't entirely sure they would. The merchant's snoring gradually transitions into mumbled complaints about the quality of ship accommodations, as if he'd been expecting a 4-star hotel experience. His hair is sticking up in configurations that suggest he spent the night wrestling with electrical equipment, and his clothes look like they've been put through a medieval washing machine that runs on chaos and spite. The pilgrim emerges from his hammock looking like he's seen divine visions, though they were probably just hallucinations brought on by oxygen deprivation and terror. His prayers have intensified overnight, and he's now including specific requests for better sleeping arrangements in his negotiations with various saints. He clutches his religious medallions like they're life preservers, which, considering the circumstances, they might be. The experienced traveler rises from his hammock with the casual competence of someone who's been through this routine countless times. He offers a cheerful "good morning" that sounds genuinely optimistic, which makes you question either his sanity or your own. He begins dispensing advice about the day ahead, including helpful tips like, don't eat the breakfast and try to stay upwind of the livestock, and today's a good day to make peace with your maker, just in case. You attempt to extract yourself from your hammock with whatever dignity you have left, which isn't much. Your muscles have apparently forgotten how to coordinate basic movement, and you stumble around the lower deck like a newborn deer with inner ear problems. The hammock doesn't want to release you, clinging to you like it's developed separation anxiety, and you have to perform what can only be described as a reverse birth to escape its fabric embrace. Your legs, when you finally get them under you, feel like they've been replaced with rubber tubes filled with pudding. The ship's constant motion has apparently convinced your inner ear that gravity is just a suggestion, and you find yourself reaching for support that isn't there and leaning against walls that are definitely not where you thought they were. The experienced traveler watches your performance with the satisfaction of someone who remembers his own first night and is enjoying the fact that it's now someone else's turn to suffer. As you make your way toward the ladder leading to the upper deck, stepping carefully around puddles of water that you hope are seawater, you catch a glimpse of yourself in a piece of polished metal hanging from one of the support beams. You look like you've been shipwrecked before the voyage even really began, hair sticking out in directions that defy gravity, clothes twisted into configurations that suggest you've been wrestling with an octopus, and an expression that perfectly captures the moment when someone realizes they've made a terrible mistake, but it's too late to do anything about it. The reflection shows someone who looks like they've aged several years in a single night, with eyes that have seen things that can't be unseen and a general air of having been personally betrayed by the concept of sleep. Your clothes hang on you like they're trying to escape, and there are stains on your person that you can't remember acquiring but probably don't want to investigate too closely. The morning light filtering down through the deck above promises a new day full of fresh opportunities to question your sanity, and you're pretty sure things are only going to get worse from here. The experienced traveler cheerfully confirms this suspicion, explaining that the first night is traditionally the easiest because you haven't yet experienced the true horrors of medieval maritime cuisine, weather, or the ship's unique approach to personal hygiene. But hey, at least you survived your first night, which, according to the experienced traveler, makes you better than about 30% of first-time passengers. That's either encouraging or deeply disturbing, and you're too tired to figure out which. The merchant offers congratulations that sound suspiciously sarcastic. The pilgrim includes your survival in his morning prayers, and the rats look disappointed that they won't be dividing up your possessions just yet. As you prepare to climb the ladder to face whatever fresh hells await above deck, you realize that your relationship with sleep has been fundamentally altered. You'll never again take for granted the simple pleasure of a bed that doesn't move, a ceiling high enough to stand under, or sleeping arrangements that don't include sharing space with rodents who judge your maritime skills. The hammock has taught you humility, terror, and the true meaning of the phrase rocking the boat. Climbing back to the upper deck feels like emerging from the underworld, assuming the underworld was designed by someone with a grudge against basic human comfort. Your legs wobble like overcooked noodles as you haul yourself up the ladder, and the morning sunlight hits your eyes with the force of divine judgment. The fresh air is a revelation after the toxic soup you've been breathing below deck. But your relief is short-lived because it's time for breakfast, and medieval ship breakfast is an experience that redefines your relationship with food. The ship's cook, and we're using that term very loosely, has set up what can only be described as a culinary disaster area near the main mast. He's a weathered man with the complexion of old leather and the hygiene standards of a medieval plague victim. His cooking pot looks like it's seen more battles than most nights, with a coating of what you hope is just accumulated seasoning but suspect might be archaeological layers of previous meals gone wrong. The first item on the breakfast menu is hardtack, which sounds harmless until you realize it's basically medieval concrete disguised as food. These ship biscuits are harder than the ship's hull and about as nutritious as eating the rope that holds the sails. The cook hands you what appears to be a small stone tablet, and you quickly understand why medieval sailors had such impressive jaw muscles. It's not from singing sea shanties. It's from trying to chew food that was designed to survive longer than the passengers. Hardtack was the foundation of medieval maritime cuisine, and by foundation, we mean it had roughly the same consistency as building materials. These biscuits were baked until they achieved the approximate hardness of fossilized bread, then stored in barrels where they could age like fine wine, if fine wine were made of flour and regret. The theory was that hardtack would keep indefinitely without spoiling, which was technically true because it was already in a state that couldn't get much worse. You attempt your first bite and immediately understand why the experienced passengers are soaking their portions in whatever liquid they can find. The hardtack doesn't so much break apart as chip away like you're eating sedimentary rock. Your teeth make contact with a sound that echoes across the deck, causing several crew members to look over with expressions of sympathy and amusement. The flavor is best described as aggressive blandness, with hints of sawdust and disappointment. But here's where things get interesting, and by interesting, we mean absolutely horrifying. As you gnaw on your breakfast, small holes appear in the hardtack, revealing that you're not alone in your culinary experience. Weevil-steiny beetles that have taken up residence in the ship's food supply begin emerging from your breakfast like the world's most disturbing surprise party. These little creatures have been living in the hardtack, treating it as both home and food source, which technically makes them more successful at maritime survival than you are. The weevils aren't just occasional visitors theory permanent residents of the ship's food stores, and they've established a thriving civilization inside your breakfast. Medieval sailors had a saying, "The hungrier you are, the less you notice the protein." The weevils were actually considered a good sign because their presence meant the hardtack still had some nutritional value left, even if that nutrition was currently crawling around on 6 legs. Historians still argue whether medieval sailors genuinely didn't mind eating insect-infested food, or if they simply reached a level of hunger where anything that wouldn't immediately kill them started looking appetizing. Ship records from the period suggest that weevil-free hardtack was actually considered suspicious, since it might mean the biscuits were so old and devoid of nutrition that even insects wouldn't eat them. The cook notices your horrified expression and offers what he clearly considers helpful advice. Just close your eyes and pretend they're nuts. This suggestion comes from a man whose idea of seasoning appears to be seawater and optimism, so you're not inclined to trust his culinary judgment. Other passengers demonstrate various weevil management techniques, ranging from picking them out individually to adopting the eat everything and hope for the best approach. You watch in fascination and horror as the merchant carefully removes each weevil from his hardtack, creating a small pile of insects that looks like he's preparing some kind of medieval tapas. The pilgrims seem to view the weevils as a test of faith, consuming them with expressions that suggest they're offering up their disgust as a form of prayer. The experienced traveler just eats everything without looking, maintaining the philosophical stance that what you don't see can't traumatize you. The ship's water situation provides the next challenge to your digestive system. The water barrels you noticed yesterday have not improved with age, and the green scum floating on the surface has developed what appears to be its own weather system. Medieval ships couldn't carry enough fresh water for long voyages, so after a few days at sea, drinking water became more of a biological experiment than a beverage. The water tastes like it was strained through old socks and seasoned with regret. There's a flavor that starts as pond water and develops into something dyed in here, with a finish that can only be described as medieval chemistry experiment gone wrong. You try to convince yourself that the taste is just unfamiliar minerals, but the green chunks floating in your cup suggest otherwise. This is why medieval sailors preferred beer, wine, or anything else that had been fermented enough to kill most of the harmful bacteria. Alcohol wasn't just recreational on medieval ships, it was often safer than water because the brewing process eliminated many of the microorganisms that turned fresh water into biological warfare. Sailors who stayed sober by choice often ended up sick from the water, while their constantly tipsy shipmates remained relatively healthy. The cook offers you a bowl of what he optimistically calls porridge, but looks more like the contents of the bilge pump mixed with optimism. This gray, lumpy substance moves slightly in the bowl, either from the ship's motion or because it's achieved some form of primitive consciousness. The texture suggests it was made by someone who'd heard porridge described but had never actually seen it, and the flavor profile includes notes of sadness, maritime desperation, and what might be fish. Medieval ship porridge was typically made from whatever grain hadn't been completely consumed by rodents, mixed with seawater because fresh water was too valuable to waste on cooking. The result was a substance that had the nutritional value of wet cardboard and roughly the same flavor profile. Smart sailors learned to add whatever they could find to make it more palatable: salt, dried herbs, or in desperate times, their own tears. You take a tentative spoonful and immediately understand why the crew looks so thin despite doing physical labor all day. This isn't food so much as edible punishment, designed by someone who believed that nutrition should come with a side of suffering. The porridge has achieved that perfect consistency where it's simultaneously too thick and too thin, creating a texture that your mouth doesn't know how to process. The livestock on deck remember that goat from yesterday, are eating better than the passengers. The animals get relatively fresh hay and grain, while the humans get whatever's left after the rats, weevils, and general maritime decay have finished their share. This creates the disturbing realization that in the ship's hierarchy of feeding, you rank somewhere below a goat but above the rats, though the rats seem to be doing better than anyone when it comes to finding edible food. As you struggle with breakfast, the ship's motion adds another layer of challenge to the dining experience. Every wave sends your porridge sliding across the bowl like it's trying to escape, and drinking from a cup becomes an exercise in timing that would challenge a professional acrobat. You learn to eat quickly during the brief moments when the ship is relatively stable, then hold onto your stomach and pray during the periods when everything tilts at impossible angles. The other passengers are demonstrating various techniques for eating while seasick, ranging from the close your eyes and swallow quickly method to the take tiny bites and breathe through your nose approach. The experienced traveler explains that the key is to keep something in your stomach at all times, because throwing up on an empty stomach is somehow worse than throwing up after eating medieval ship food, which tells you everything you need to know about the quality of medieval maritime cuisine. Your fellow passenger's breakfast conversation reveals the full scope of what you've gotten yourself into. The merchant complains about the food while simultaneously calculating whether he could make a profit selling ship's biscuits to people who'd never been to sea. The pilgrims discuss whether suffering through inedible meals counts as penance for their sins, and they seem genuinely pleased that their spiritual journey includes culinary torture. The experienced traveler shares helpful information about what to expect from future meals, including detailed descriptions of salt pork that's been preserved so long it's achieved the consistency of leather, and fish that's been dried until it resembles pieces of rope with scales. He explains the ship's meal schedule with the enthusiasm of someone describing a particularly creative form of torture, noting that dinner will feature mystery meat and vegetables that have been pickled beyond recognition. Medieval ship preservation techniques were based on the principle that if you could make food inhospitable enough to bacteria, it might remain technically edible for the duration of the voyage. This resulted in meals that had been salted, dried, pickled, or treated with enough preservatives to essentially mummify them. The food didn't go bad because it had achieved a state where even decomposition bacteria found it too unappetizing to consume. You notice that several crew members are supplementing their official rations with what appears to be fishing equipment. They've rigged lines over the side of the ship in hopes of catching something fresh, though the experienced traveler warns that even fresh fish becomes problematic when you have no way to cook it properly and limited supplies of salt for preservation. The crew's fishing efforts seem more hopeful than successful, but you admire their optimism. The ship's cook explains his philosophy of maritime cuisine, which apparently involves the belief that if food is technically edible, flavor is just a luxury for people who aren't grateful enough for basic survival. He describes his cooking methods with the pride of someone who's convinced he's providing a valuable service, despite evidence to the contrary in the form of passengers who look progressively more malnourished with each meal. As breakfast concludes, and by concludes, we mean you give up trying to consume substances that might technically qualify as food, you begin to understand why medieval sailors often looked forward to reaching port with an enthusiasm that went beyond simple wanderlust. The prospect of fresh bread, clean water, and food that didn't require an archaeological expedition to determine its original identity becomes incredibly motivating. The cleanup process after meals involves throwing the leftover food overboard, which immediately attracts a following of seabirds and marine life that seem better adapted to processing medieval ship cuisine than human digestive systems. You watch pieces of hardtack sink into the ocean like small stones, probably destined to become some kind of seafloor archaeological deposit for future marine biologists to puzzle over. Your stomach, having processed what it could of breakfast and rejected the rest, begins sending urgent messages about its dissatisfaction with your recent life choices. The combination of unfamiliar food, constant ship motion, and general anxiety about being trapped on a floating wooden box in the middle of the ocean creates a digestive situation that would challenge even modern medical professionals. The experienced traveler offers advice about managing seasickness and food-related digestive distress, including helpful tips like try to throw up downwind, and don't eat anything you can't afford to lose, and make peace with the fact that your stomach will hate you for the entire voyage. His suggestions come with the authority of someone who's survived multiple maritime dining experiences and lived to complain about them. As the morning progresses and your body continues processing breakfast, you realize that medieval ship food serves multiple purposes beyond basic nutrition. It builds character, teaches humility, and provides a shared experience that bonds passengers together in mutual suffering. Everyone who's eaten ship's biscuits has something in common. We all survived something that shouldn't technically be possible. The merchant suggests that the food situation might improve as the voyage continues, but the experienced traveler's expression suggests this is wishful thinking. Medieval ships didn't carry refrigeration. Fresh supplies spoiled quickly in salt air, and resupplying at sea was impossible. This means that today's barely edible breakfast represents the peak of culinary luxury you can expect for the duration of the voyage. You look around at your fellow passengers and crew members, all of whom are dealing with the same dietary challenges, and feel a strange sense of camaraderie. You're all in this together, united by the shared experience of trying to survive on food that would be rejected by most farm animals. The hardtack may be harder than stone. The water may be developing its own ecosystem, and the porridge may be achieving consciousness, but at least everyone is suffering equally. As you prepare for whatever the day ahead will bring, you make a mental note to never again complain about modern food safety standards, preservation techniques, or the quality of airplane meals. Medieval ship cuisine has provided you with a new perspective on what constitutes edible food, and that perspective is both humbling and slightly terrifying. The weevils in your hardtack seem to be looking at you with what might be gratitude for providing them with transportation to new destinations, and you're starting to wonder if they're the real passengers and you're just along for the ride. Now that you've successfully traumatized your digestive system with breakfast, it's time to discover where medieval ships stored their most essential facility, the bathroom. And by bathroom, we mean a wooden box hanging over the ocean that represents humanity's most optimistic approach to maritime sanitation. The ship's head is located at the bow, which sounds nautical and official until you realize it's basically a toilet seat suspended over shark-infested waters with all the structural integrity of a house of cards in a hurricane. The journey to the ship's facilities is an adventure in itself, requiring you to navigate across a deck that's slippery with seawater, grease, and substances you've learned not to investigate too closely. You cling to ropes and railings while the ship pitches and rolls, trying not to think about what happens if you lose your footing during this particular expedition. The crew members you pass offer encouraging comments like, "Don't fall in," and "Watch out for the big waves," and "Hope you're not afraid of heights," which does absolutely nothing for your confidence. The medieval ship's head was positioned at the bow because that's where the ship's forward motion and wave action would theoretically wash waste away from the vessel. This was sound thinking in principle, but in practice, it meant that using the facilities required hanging your most vulnerable body parts over the ocean during the ship's most violent pitching motions. Medieval naval architects apparently believed that personal hygiene should come with a side of extreme sports. When you finally reach the head, you discover that calling it a facility is like calling a natural disaster a weather event, technically accurate but dramatically understating the situation. The structure consists of a wooden seat with a hole in the middle, suspended over the ocean by ropes and wooden supports that look like they were installed by someone who'd heard about engineering but never actually studied it. Below the seat, there's nothing but open ocean, which means you're essentially about to conduct very personal business while dangling over an aquatic wilderness. The seat itself has been worn smooth by countless previous users, which is either comforting or deeply disturbing depending on how you choose to think about it. The wood is stained and weathered, creating a patina that tells the story of every passenger who's ever faced this particular challenge. There are handholds carved into the sides not for comfort, but because previous users quickly learned that maintaining your position requires the grip strength of a professional rock climber. Historians still argue whether medieval sailors genuinely considered this an acceptable bathroom solution, or if it was just the best they could manage given the technological limitations of floating wooden boxes. What we know for certain is that medieval maritime records include surprisingly detailed discussions of head-related accidents, suggesting that bathroom breaks were considered notable events worthy of documentation. The privacy situation is about what you'd expect from a toilet that's essentially hanging off the front of a ship in full view of anyone who cares to look. Medieval concepts of personal privacy were already pretty relaxed compared to modern standards, but the ship's head takes this to an extreme that would make exhibitionists uncomfortable. You're conducting intimate business while surrounded by ocean, sky, and any crew members who happen to be working in the area. The experienced traveler, who somehow managed to follow you despite your attempts at discretion, offers helpful advice about proper head technique. This includes instructions on optimal grip placement, breathing techniques for managing fear of heights, and the importance of timing your visit with the ship's motion to avoid what he delicately refers to as splashback incidents. His casual expertise in bathroom logistics is both impressive and deeply concerning. Using the head during calm weather is challenging enough, but you quickly discover that the ocean has no interest in accommodating your bathroom schedule. Waves crash against the ship's bow with enough force to send spray flying in all directions, including directly up through the hole in the seat where you're conducting business. This creates a refreshing experience that redefines your understanding of the phrase, wash and go. The water below is a dark blue-green that suggests considerable depth, and you can occasionally see shapes moving beneath the surface that might be fish, dolphins, or things you'd rather not identify. Medieval sailors believed that certain sea creatures were attracted to ships specifically to feed on waste, which is either an interesting example of maritime ecology or the most disturbing food chain you've ever been part of. Either way, you're now technically feeding the ocean's wildlife, whether you wanted to or not. The rope system holding the head in place creaks ominously with every wave, creating sounds that suggest the entire structure is having an ongoing argument with the laws of physics. Medieval rope was made from hemp fibers twisted together with techniques that prioritize speed over longevity, so you're trusting your safety to materials that were probably past their prime when they were first installed. The ropes stretch and contract with each wave, creating a motion that's part carnival ride, part trust exercise. Medieval sailors developed various techniques for managing the head experience, ranging from the get in and get out as quickly as possible approach to the embrace the maritime lifestyle and make friends with the ocean philosophy. Some sailors tied themselves to the structure with additional rope, which provided safety but created logistics challenges that required advanced planning. Others perfected a technique that involved timing their business with the ship's motion to minimize exposure to spray and maximize efficiency. The toilet paper situation, and you probably already guessed this would be problematic, involves whatever fabric scraps or rope fibers you can find, assuming you're fortunate enough to find any at all. Medieval ships didn't carry supplies specifically designated for bathroom use, so passengers learned to save fabric scraps, use pieces of canvas, or in desperate situations, sacrifice parts of their clothing to the cause of personal hygiene. The wind direction becomes a critical factor in head usage, because what goes down doesn't necessarily stay down if the wind decides to redirect it back toward the ship. Experienced sailors check wind patterns before using the facilities, timing their visits to coincide with favorable atmospheric conditions. This turns bathroom breaks into meteorological calculations that would challenge a weather forecaster. You discover that the head doubles as an excellent vantage point for observing marine life, assuming you're calm enough to appreciate the view while conducting personal business. From this position, you can see dolphins playing in the ship's wake, seabirds diving for fish, and occasionally larger creatures that remind you exactly how small and vulnerable your floating wooden box really is. The ocean stretches to the horizon in all directions, creating a view that's simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The sound effects of using the head include the constant crash of waves against the ship's bow, the creaking of ropes and wood, and the wind whistling through the rigging above. These natural sound effects create an audio environment that's part nature documentary, part adventure movie, and part anxiety-inducing reminder of your precarious position. Medieval sailors probably developed impressive meditation skills just to cope with bathroom-related stress. Other passengers wait their turn with expressions that range from patient resignation to desperate urgency, creating a social dynamic around bathroom access that doesn't exist in land-based societies. The head queue involves discussions about timing, weather conditions, and shared strategies for surviving the experience. Everyone becomes an expert on maritime bathroom logistics, whether they want to or not. The cleanup process after using the head involves whatever seawater you can splash up from below, assuming the waves are cooperative enough to provide access to relatively clean ocean water. Medieval ships didn't carry supplies for personal hygiene, so passengers learned to work with whatever natural resources were available. This typically meant seawater, which is better than nothing but creates its own challenges in terms of salt content and temperature. You begin to understand why medieval sailors had such a complicated relationship with personal cleanliness. It wasn't just about cultural differences or lack of knowledge about hygiene, it was about the practical impossibility of maintaining modern cleanliness standards while living on a wooden box surrounded by salt water. The head represents the ship's best effort at sanitation, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval maritime living standards. The return journey from the head to the main deck requires the same careful navigation you used to get there, but now you're dealing with the additional challenge of feeling simultaneously relieved and traumatized. You cling to the same ropes and railings, but with a new appreciation for solid ground and conventional bathroom facilities. The crew members you pass offer congratulations on your successful completion of a head visit, treating it like an achievement worth celebrating. Medieval maritime culture included specific etiquette around head usage, including unwritten rules about timing, privacy, and sharing information about optimal conditions for bathroom visits. Passengers developed a camaraderie around the shared experience of surviving the ship's sanitation facilities, bonding over war stories about particularly challenging head encounters and tips for managing various maritime bathroom scenarios. The psychological impact of the head experience extends beyond simple bathroom logistics. Using facilities that hang over the open ocean while suspended from a moving ship creates a unique form of anxiety that combines fear of heights, fear of water, fear of falling, and basic human vulnerability into one concentrated experience. Medieval sailors who used these facilities regularly developed either impressive courage or complete resignation to their maritime fate. You notice that some passengers time their head visits to coincide with meals, either to minimize the time between eating and using bathroom facilities, or to ensure they have something to throw up if seasickness strikes during the bathroom experience. This creates a complex scheduling system where bathroom breaks become integrated with the ship's daily rhythm of meals, weather, and maritime activities. The head also serves as a weather station, providing passengers with first-hand experience of changing ocean conditions. From this exposed position, you can feel shifts in wind direction, changes in wave patterns, and the approach of weather systems before they affect the rest of the ship. Medieval sailors often used head visits as opportunities to assess sea conditions and predict upcoming weather changes. As you make your way back to the relative safety of the main deck, you realize that the ship's head has taught you valuable lessons about medieval maritime life. It's a perfect example of how people in the past adapted to impossible circumstances with whatever solutions they could manage, even if those solutions would terrify modern sensibilities. The head represents both human ingenuity and the harsh realities of life at sea, combined into one unforgettable experience. The other passengers who are waiting their turn look at you with expressions that suggest they're hoping for reassurance that the experience is survivable. You offer what you hope are encouraging smiles, though you suspect your expression probably looks more like someone who's just survived a natural disaster. The experienced traveler gives you an approving nod, recognizing that you've successfully completed another initiation into medieval maritime life. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we haven't talked about yet? Well, compared to medieval ship bathroom facilities, ancient Egyptian beauty treatments are starting to look pretty reasonable. At least crocodile dung stayed on land where it belonged, instead of requiring you to hang over an ocean to deal with waste management. The head experience puts everything else about medieval ship life into perspective. If you can survive the bathroom facilities, you might actually make it through this voyage. As you settle back onto the main deck, trying to process what you've just experienced, you realize that modern bathroom facilities represent one of humanity's greatest achievements. Indoor plumbing, privacy, solid floors, and toilets that don't require risking your life to use are luxuries that most people take for granted. The medieval ship's head has given you a new appreciation for basic sanitation infrastructure and the engineers who designed it. The day is still young, and you've already survived sleeping quarters that doubled as rodent habitat and bathroom facilities that redefined extreme sports. What could possibly go wrong next? Spoiler alert, everything. Now that you've survived breakfast and the world's most terrifying bathroom experience, it's time to discover what medieval sailors did for entertainment, which is to say, they worked until their hands bled, their backs broke, and their souls questioned every life decision that led them to this floating purgatory. The ship's bell clangs with the enthusiasm of someone announcing the apocalypse, and suddenly every crew member transforms from lazy morning shufflers into caffeinated productivity machines with a death wish. The first mate appears on deck like a maritime drill sergeant who learned motivational techniques from medieval torture manuals. He's got the voice projection of someone who spent years shouting over hurricane winds and the management style of someone who believes that physical exhaustion builds character. His instructions come rapid fire in a mixture of nautical terminology and creative profanity that would make Shakespeare weep with envy. All hands on deck isn't a suggestion, it's maritime law enforced by people who consider drowning a reasonable consequence for slacking off. As a passenger, you're technically not required to participate in ship operations, but the crew's meaningful glances and the first mate's pointed comments about dead weight make it clear that voluntary assistance isn't actually voluntary. You're about to discover why medieval sailors had forearms like tree trunks and the life expectancy of mayflies. The rigging stretches above you like a three-dimensional puzzle designed by someone with serious trust issues and a grudge against gravity. These ropes aren't just decoration theory, the ship's nervous system, controlling everything from sail position to structural integrity. Each line has a specific name, function, and capacity to kill you if handled incorrectly. The crew expects you to learn this system while the ship pitches and rolls like a mechanical bull operated by a caffeinated Viking. Your first assignment involves helping to adjust the mainsail, which sounds simple until you realize that helping means grabbing a rope that's under enough tension to cut you in half and pulling it in coordination with a dozen other people who actually know what they're doing. The rope is rough hemp that immediately begins shredding your soft landlubber hands, creating a burning sensation that suggests your palms are being processed into medieval jerky. Medieval sailing required constant adjustment of sails, rigging, and equipment based on wind conditions, weather changes, and the ship's heading. This wasn't a set-it-and-forget-it operation, it was continuous manual labor performed by people dangling from ropes high above a deck that was already dangerously far above the ocean. Every sail adjustment required coordinated teamwork that would challenge a professional dance troupe, except the dancers weren't usually risking death by drowning or falling. The crew demonstrates rope handling techniques that look simple until you try them yourself and discover that your hands are apparently made of pudding, and your coordination was designed for activities that don't involve heavy objects swinging through the air at head level. The experienced sailors move with casual efficiency, their hands covered in calluses thick enough to stop small projectiles, while your delicate palms begin bleeding within the first 5 minutes. Historians still argue whether medieval sailors genuinely enjoyed the physical demands of shipboard life, or if they simply reached a level of exhaustion where complaining required more energy than they could spare. Ship records from the period suggest that crew members developed a philosophical acceptance of constant pain and exhaustion, treating bodily discomfort as just another aspect of the maritime lifestyle. The wind decides to shift direction just as you're getting the hang of basic rope handling, which means everything you've learned in the past hour is now completely wrong. The crew springs into action with practiced efficiency while you stand there holding a rope and trying to figure out whether you're supposed to pull it, release it, or use it to hang yourself before the incompetence kills you. The first mate's shouted instructions might as well be in ancient Greek, assuming ancient Greek included a lot more swearing about wind direction. Working aloft, which means climbing the rigging to adjust sails high above the deckies, apparently considered routine maritime duty rather than the suicide mission it clearly represents. You watch crew members scramble up rope ladders that sway and stretch with every wave, carrying tools and equipment while maintaining their balance through pure muscle memory and what appears to be a complete disregard for personal safety. The mast stretches above you like a tree that someone forgot to plant in the ground, swaying back and forth with enough force to make you seasick just from watching it. Crew members work at heights that would require safety equipment and extensive insurance waivers in any sensible society. But medieval sailors apparently considered falling to your death just another occupational hazard, like splinters or scurvy. When your turn comes to climb the rigging, and yes, they expect passengers to participate in activities that would challenge professional circus performers, you discover that rope ladders are basically vertical torture devices designed to test your grip strength, core stability, and commitment to survival. Each step up takes you further from the relative safety of the deck and closer to a perspective that makes the ocean look like an endless blue carpet of death. The view from halfway up the mast is simultaneously spectacular and terrifying. You can see for miles in every direction, watching waves roll toward the ship like moving mountains of water that seem determined to test the vessel's structural integrity. The horizon stretches in a perfect circle around you, creating the disturbing realization that you're essentially trapped in the center of an aquatic wilderness with no land visible in any direction. Working in the rigging requires you to use muscles you didn't know you had while maintaining your balance on ropes that move independently of each other in patterns that defy prediction. Medieval sailors developed the ability to work with their hands while hanging from rigging using only their legs and core strength, performing tasks that would challenge a professional gymnast while dealing with wind, spray, and the constant motion of the ship. The sails themselves are massive sheets of canvas that catch the wind with enough force to drag the entire ship across the ocean. But they also create their own weather system of flapping fabric, whipping ropes, and sudden direction changes that can knock an unprepared sailor off the rigging faster than you can say, "Man overboard." Medieval sailcloth was woven from hemp or flax fibers, creating fabric that was both incredibly strong and remarkably good at collecting every drop of moisture in the immediate vicinity. You learn to work while soaking wet, which is the default condition for anyone spending time in the rigging. The combination of sea spray and sail-generated moisture means that dry clothing is a theoretical concept rather than a practical expectation. Medieval sailors wore wool because it retained some insulating properties even when wet, but wool clothing that's constantly damp develops its own unique aroma that adds another layer to the ship's already impressive collection of unpleasant smells. The rope work never stops. Even when the sails are properly set and the ship is running smoothly, there's always something that needs adjusting, repairing, or replacing. Medieval hemp rope had a limited lifespan under the constant stress of shipboard use, so crew members spent significant time splicing new rope, repairing damaged lines, and replacing equipment that had worn beyond safe use limits. Your hands, which started the day as recognizably human appendages, are now transformed into raw, bleeding reminders of why medieval people had such different relationships with manual labor. The rope burns across your palms create patterns that look like primitive tattoos, and your fingers have developed a permanent claw-like shape from gripping lines under tension. The experienced sailors offer advice like, "The bleeding stops eventually," and "Try not to look at your hands too closely," and pain is just weakness leaving the body through your palms. The ship's carpenter appears regularly to assess damage to the rigging and recommend repairs that need to be completed immediately to prevent catastrophic failure. His running commentary on the ship's structural integrity includes cheerful observations like, "This rope should have been replaced last month," and "I'm surprised that mast is still standing, and if this wind gets any stronger, we might lose the entire mainsail." His professional expertise is both reassuring and absolutely terrifying. Medieval ships required constant maintenance to remain seaworthy, and most of this maintenance had to be performed while the vessel was underway. There were no dry docks or repair facilities in the middle of the ocean, so crews had to fix everything from hull damage to rigging failure using whatever materials they had on board and their own ingenuity. This created a maritime culture where every sailor needed to be part carpenter, part rigger, and part miracle worker. The physical demands of shipboard work are relentless. Just when you think you've mastered one task, the wind changes or the weather shifts, requiring completely different techniques and equipment. Medieval sailing was essentially a continuous athletic performance that lasted for the entire voyage, performed by people who had no choice but to maintain peak physical condition or risk not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone aboard. You discover that medieval maritime work songs weren't just entertainment, they were coordination tools that helped crews synchronize their efforts during complex operations. The rhythm of the songs matched the timing needed for rope work, sail handling, and other tasks that required multiple people working together. These sea shanties served as both communication system and morale booster, helping crews maintain coordination while dealing with exhaustion and stress. The hierarchy of shipboard labor becomes clear as you watch experienced sailors directing newer crew members through increasingly complex tasks. Everyone has a role, everyone has responsibilities, and everyone's performance directly affects the ship's safety and efficiency. There's no room for individualism or personal preference when the ship's survival depends on coordinated teamwork performed under extreme conditions. As the day progresses, you begin to understand why medieval sailors developed such strong opinions about weather. Every change in wind direction or wave pattern requires immediate response from the crew, turning routine sailing into a continuous series of crisis management exercises. The crew monitors weather conditions with the intensity of people whose lives depend on atmospheric cooperation, because their lives literally depend on atmospheric cooperation. The sun beats down on the deck with enough intensity to cook food, while the wind and spray provide intermittent cooling that never quite compensates for the heat generated by constant physical labor. Medieval sailors worked without sunscreen, hats, or any protection beyond whatever clothing they could keep on their bodies while climbing around in the rigging. This created a population of maritime workers who looked like they'd been carved from weathered leather and seasoned with salt. Your fellow passengers who volunteered for shipboard work are discovering their own limitations in real time. The merchant, who probably hasn't done physical labor since childhood, is learning that counting coins doesn't build the muscle mass needed for hauling rope under tension. The pilgrims are finding that spiritual preparation doesn't necessarily translate to practical sailing skills, though their prayers are becoming increasingly specific about requests for strength and coordination. By afternoon, when the first mate finally calls for a break in the work, you collapse onto the deck with the same grace as a sack of wet grain. Your entire body aches in places you didn't know could ache. Your hands look like they've been fed through a medieval paper shredder, and your muscles are sending urgent messages about the need for retirement. The experienced sailors look slightly tired, which means they're probably operating at about half their normal energy level while you're discovering muscles you never knew existed. The break includes more of that questionable water and hardtack, but after hours of physical labor, even weevil-infested ship biscuits start looking like acceptable nutrition. You gnaw on your food with the desperate enthusiasm of someone who's learned that calories are more important than flavor when you're burning energy faster than you can consume it. The weevils are starting to look like bonus protein rather than unwelcome dinner guests. As you sit there trying to process the fact that this represents just one morning of medieval maritime life, and you've got weeks or months of this ahead of you, you begin to understand why medieval sailors had such a complicated relationship with the ocean. The sea provided adventure, opportunity, and the chance to see the world, but it also demanded a level of physical commitment that would challenge modern athletes. Every day on a medieval ship was essentially a full-body workout performed under conditions that would violate multiple safety regulations in any reasonable society. The afternoon shift promises more of the same rope work, sail handling, and general maritime athletics, because medieval ships didn't recognize concepts like reasonable work hours or ergonomic considerations. The experienced traveler offers encouraging words like, "You'll either get stronger or die trying," and "the blisters eventually turn into calluses," and "think of this as character-building exercise with a chance of drowning." Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we mentioned? Right about now, ancient Egyptian beauty treatments are sounding pretty sophisticated compared to medieval maritime labor practices. At least the Egyptians were trying to protect themselves from the sun, while medieval sailors just accepted sunburn as another form of occupational hazard. Your hands look like they've been introduced to a medieval torture device, and the day is only half over. Just when you think your hands can't get any more destroyed and your back can't ache any worse, you discover that medieval ships came equipped with their own personal medical professional, and by medical professional, we mean the ship's barber surgeon, a man whose qualifications include once saw someone else pull a tooth, and owns a really sharp knife. His medical kit looks like a collection of tools that could double as medieval torture devices, which is probably not a coincidence since medieval medicine often resembled officially sanctioned cruelty with a dash of wishful thinking. The ship's surgeon has set up his practice in a corner of the deck that he optimistically calls his surgery, though it's really just a wooden box containing an assortment of knives, saws, needles, and substances that might be medicine or might be experimental poisons nobody's entirely sure, including him. His credentials appear to be based primarily on enthusiasm rather than actual medical training, and his bedside manner suggests someone who learned patient care from studying medieval execution techniques. You're introduced to this medical marvel when one of the crew members approaches him with what appears to be a relatively minor cut from rope work. The surgeon examines the wound with the focused intensity of someone trying to remember whether he's supposed to clean it or just cut off the affected limb and call it a day. His diagnostic technique involves poking the injury with instruments that look like they've been borrowed from a medieval kitchen, while offering commentary like, "That looks infected and might need to come off," and "Has anyone seen my good saw?" Medieval maritime medicine was based on the revolutionary theory that most medical problems could be solved by either bleeding the patient until they felt better or cutting off whatever part was causing trouble. This approach had the advantage of being relatively straightforward and the disadvantage of frequently killing people who might have recovered with less aggressive treatment. Ship surgeons were essentially carpenters who'd branched out into human repair work, bringing the same practical problem-solving approach they'd use on broken masts to broken bones. The surgeon's treatment of the rope cut involves first cleaning the wound with seawater, which sounds reasonable until you remember that medieval ship seawater was the same water the crew used as a bathroom. He then applies what he calls a healing poultice, but looks suspiciously like a mixture of tar, crushed hardtack, and optimism. The patient receives this treatment with the resigned expression of someone who's learned that medical care is often worse than the original problem. Historians still argue whether medieval ship surgeons genuinely believed their treatments were effective, or if they were just doing their best with limited knowledge and equipment while hoping that prayer and luck would compensate for their lack of actual medical training. What we know for certain is that medieval maritime medicine had a mortality rate that made the original injuries look like minor inconveniences. Your fellow passengers are discovering their own medical needs as the voyage progresses. The merchant has developed what appears to be scurvy symptoms, despite being at sea for less than a week, which suggests either remarkable biological efficiency or hypochondria that would impress medieval physicians. His complaints include bleeding gums, loose teeth, and general weakness, though these symptoms might also be explained by the combination of ship food, constant seasickness, and the psychological stress of being trapped on a floating wooden box with questionable navigation. The surgeon's approach to scurvy treatment involves bloodletting, because medieval medicine believed that most diseases were caused by having too much blood, and the solution was obviously to remove some of it until the patient felt better or died, whichever came first. His bloodletting technique involves leeches that he keeps in a jar of murky water, and these medical assistants look about as healthy as you'd expect from creatures living in a container that hasn't been cleaned since the ship left port. The leeches themselves are impressive specimens, dark creatures that seem to have adapted well to maritime life and developed a taste for sailor blood that suggests they're either very good at their job or they've just learned to enjoy their work. The surgeon applies them with the casual confidence of someone who's convinced that attaching blood-sucking parasites to sick people represents the height of medical sophistication. The leeches attach with enthusiasm and begin their work with what can only be described as professional dedication. Medieval physicians believed that leeches could cure everything from headaches to heartbreak by removing bad blood from the patient's system. This theory had the advantage of being completely wrong and the disadvantage of frequently making patients sicker than they were before treatment. Ship surgeons particularly favored leeches because they were relatively easy to keep alive on long voyages and didn't require complex preparation or storage. The pilgrims in your group approach medical treatment with the philosophical stance that illness is probably divine punishment for their sins, which means that suffering through medieval medicine is actually additional penance that might help with their spiritual development. This creates an interesting dynamic where patients are grateful for treatments that would be considered torture in any reasonable medical system. Their faith in divine intervention combines with their trust in the surgeon's expertise to create a patient population that's remarkably cooperative with procedures that should probably come with warning labels. One of the pilgrims develops what appears to be a tooth problem, a common issue on ships where the combination of hard food, vitamin deficiency, and general stress tends to accelerate dental decay. The surgeon's approach to dentistry involves pliers that look like they were designed for pulling nails rather than teeth, and his anesthetic technique consists of giving the patient a piece of rope to bite down on while he works. The extraction process sounds like someone tearing apart a wooden ship from the inside, and the patient's expression suggests he's having a religious experience, though not necessarily a pleasant one. Medieval dental care was based on the principle that tooth pain was better than no teeth at all, so extraction was considered a last resort after treatments like prayer, bleeding, and applying various poultices that usually made the problem worse. Ship dentistry was particularly challenging because patients couldn't be given time to recover in comfortable surroundings. They had to return to regular duties immediately after having body parts removed with primitive tools. The surgeon's pharmaceutical supplies consist of substances that might be medicine, spices, or materials that accidentally fell into his medical kit from other parts of the ship. His bottles and jars contain powders, liquids, and mysterious substances that he identifies with names like healing powder and strength tonic and general cure-all, though their actual contents remain a mystery that he seems reluctant to discuss in detail. Medieval maritime medicine relied heavily on herbal remedies and folk treatments that had been passed down through generations of sailors who may or may not have known what they were doing. These remedies were mixed with superstition, religious belief, and whatever substances happened to be available on board, creating a pharmaceutical system that was part chemistry, part wishful thinking, and part accidental poisoning. You watch the surgeon prepare what he calls a stomach tonic for passengers suffering from seasickness, combining various powders with ship water to create a substance that looks like muddy liquid and smells like decomposing seaweed. His preparation technique suggests someone who's learned medicine by watching other people work rather than through any formal training, and his confidence in the results seems based more on optimism than evidence. The seasickness treatment involves drinking the tonic while trying not to think too hard about its ingredients, then lying down in a position that minimizes the chances of throwing up on other passengers. The tonic has a flavor that starts as medicinal and develops into "why did I agree to this?" with a finish that suggests the cure might be worse than the seasickness. Patients who survive the treatment report mixed results, though it's unclear whether they feel better because of the medicine or because they're so relieved to stop taking it. Medieval sailors developed their own folk remedies for common shipboard ailments, creating a parallel medical system that sometimes worked better than official treatments. These remedies were based on practical experience rather than medical theory, and they were usually less dramatic than the surgeon's approaches. Sailors shared knowledge about which foods helped with scurvy, which positions reduced seasickness, and which injuries were better left alone rather than treated with medieval surgical techniques. The surgeon's surgical procedures are performed on deck in full view of anyone who's interested in watching, partly because there's no private space for medical procedures and partly because medieval medicine didn't recognize patient privacy as a meaningful concept. His operations are conducted with tools that look like they were borrowed from the ship's carpenter, sterilized with seawater and optimism, and performed with techniques that suggest he's learned surgery by watching other people work from a considerable distance. You witness him treating a crew member who's developed what appears to be an infected wound from earlier rope work. The treatment involves opening the wound wider to let the bad humors escape, cleaning it with seawater and what might be wine or might be cleaning solvent, then sewing it closed with thread that looks suspiciously like it was borrowed from the sail repairs. The patient receives this treatment with the stoic acceptance of someone who's learned that medieval medicine is best endured rather than understood. Medieval surgical techniques were based on the principle that most problems could be solved by cutting things open, removing whatever looked suspicious, and hoping that prayer and luck would handle the healing process. Ship surgeons worked without anesthesia, antibiotics, or any understanding of infection control, relying on speed and patient cooperation to get through procedures that should have required modern medical facilities. The recovery area for medical patients consists of whatever deck space isn't currently needed for ship operations, which means that people recovering from surgery have to do so while dodging rope work, sail handling, and general maritime chaos. Medieval ships didn't have sick bays or medical facilities. Patients recovered wherever they could find space to lie down, often returning to regular duties before they were fully healed because the ship couldn't spare crew members for extended recovery periods. Your own minor injuries from rope work receive the surgeon's attention whether you want it or not, because he's apparently bored and looking for opportunities to practice his craft. His examination of your rope-burned hands involves poking them with instruments while offering professional opinions like, "Those look painful and might leave scars, and could get infected if you're not careful." His treatment recommendations include washing with seawater and wrapping with cloth strips that look like they've been torn from old clothing. The bandaging process reveals that medieval medical supplies were essentially whatever fabric could be spared from other uses, cleaned to whatever standards were practical under shipboard conditions, and applied with techniques that prioritized staying attached over comfort or appearance. Your bandages look like you've been wrapped by someone who learned first aid from watching people package cargo, and they smell like a combination of seawater, tar, and previous patients. Medieval wound care was based on the theory that keeping injuries covered and relatively clean would promote healing, though the definition of clean was adjusted downward to accommodate the realities of ship life. Bandages were reused when possible, cleaned when practical, and replaced when they fell off or became so dirty that even medieval standards found them objectionable. The surgeon offers dietary advice for promoting healing, which consists primarily of eating more hardtack and drinking more water, both of which you're already consuming in quantities that would challenge a medieval monk's vow of poverty. His nutritional recommendations are based on the advanced medical theory that sick people need food and water, supplemented with whatever additional wisdom he's picked up from treating previous patients who may or may not have survived their medical care. As evening approaches and you reflect on your introduction to medieval maritime medicine, you realize that the ship's medical care represents humanity's best efforts to help people heal under impossible circumstances. The surgeon may not have formal training. His tools may look like kitchen equipment, and his treatments may seem more dangerous than the original problems. But he's genuinely trying to help people survive in an environment where professional medical care simply wasn't available. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we keep mentioning? Compared to medieval ship medicine, ancient Egyptian beauty treatments are starting to look like modern dermatology. At least the Egyptians were trying to prevent problems rather than treating them with techniques that might accidentally create new ones. Your rope-burned hands are now professionally bandaged with cloth strips that smell like maritime history, and you're beginning to appreciate the simple pleasure of medical care that doesn't involve leeches or improvised surgery. The day's medical adventures have taught you to appreciate your body's ability to heal itself, given enough time and minimal interference from well-meaning but underqualified medical professionals. Medieval maritime medicine was better than no medicine at all, but not by much, and you're already planning to avoid any injuries that might require the surgeon's more advanced treatments, just as you're beginning to think that maybe, possibly, you might survive this medieval maritime adventure with only moderate psychological trauma and minor physical dismemberment. The weather decides to remind you exactly who's in charge of this particular corner of the universe. The sky, which has been a relatively innocent blue all day, suddenly develops the ominous gray color of divine displeasure, and the wind begins making sounds that suggest the ocean has just declared war on your floating wooden home. The first sign of trouble comes from the experienced sailors, who stop their casual conversation mid-sentence and start looking at the horizon with expressions that would make professional pessimists feel optimistic by comparison. Their weather-reading skills have been honed by years of maritime experience and an impressive survival instinct that's kept them alive through conditions that killed their less observant colleagues. When these human barometers start securing loose equipment and muttering prayers in languages you can't identify, you know you're about to discover why medieval people had such complicated relationships with ocean travel. The ship's captain emerges from his cabin with the purposeful stride of someone who's either completely confident in his ability to handle whatever's coming, or who's perfected the art of looking calm while internally screaming. His weather assessment involves staring at the sky, licking his finger to test wind direction, and making the kind of nautical calculations that combine meteorological observation with maritime superstition and a healthy dose of wishful thinking. His conclusions, delivered in a tone that suggests this is routine business, include phrases like, might get a bit rough, and everyone should hold on to something solid, and try not to go overboard. Medieval weather prediction was essentially an art form practiced by people who understood that getting it wrong could kill everyone aboard, but who had no scientific instruments beyond their own experience and whatever folk wisdom they'd accumulated over years of not drowning. Ship captains developed an almost supernatural ability to read atmospheric conditions, but they were still essentially making educated guesses about forces that could destroy their vessels without warning. The clouds gathering overhead look like they've been designed by someone with a grudge against maritime commerce and a flair for dramatic atmospheric effects. They roll across the sky with the purposeful movement of storm systems that know exactly where they're going and what they plan to do when they get there. The color shifts from gray to a deeper gray that suggests the sky is developing serious opinions about the continued existence of your ship. Historians still argue whether medieval sailors genuinely enjoyed storm, whether for the excitement and challenge it provided, or if their apparent enthusiasm was just a coping mechanism for dealing with situations that were completely beyond their control. What we know for certain is that medieval maritime culture treated storms as routine occupational hazards rather than the natural disasters they clearly represented. The wind picks up with the enthusiasm of someone who's been saving up energy for a special occasion, and suddenly every rope, sail, and piece of loose equipment on the ship begins contributing to a symphony of maritime chaos that would challenge a professional orchestra. The rigging starts humming, whistling, and occasionally screaming as the wind finds new and creative ways to test the structural integrity of everything that keeps the ship functional. The first mate begins shouting orders with increased volume and urgency, his instructions becoming less conversational and more along the lines of, Do this now or we all die. His storm management technique involves getting every available person working on tasks that require immediate completion before conditions become impossible to work in. These tasks include securing cargo, adjusting sails, and preparing equipment that might be needed if the weather decides to escalate from challenging to potentially lethal. The deck beneath your feet begins moving in patterns that defy your inner ear's best efforts to maintain equilibrium. What started as gentle rocking motion has evolved into something that feels like riding a mechanical bull operated by someone with serious anger management issues and a PhD in physics. The ship climbs waves that seem impossibly tall, hangs suspended at angles that should be structurally impossible, then crashes down into troughs with enough force to make you question the wisdom of trusting your life to medieval engineering. You quickly discover that storm weather rope work requires skills that go far beyond the basic techniques you learned during calm conditions. Every line is now under tremendous stress. The deck is slippery with spray and rain that's starting to fall with increasing intensity, and working requires maintaining your balance while dealing with equipment that's trying to kill you in new and creative ways. The experienced sailors work with desperate efficiency, their movements suggesting people who understand that mistakes in storm conditions don't just mean injured fingers, they mean dead crew members. Medieval storms tested ships in ways that revealed every weakness in their construction, maintenance, and crew training. Vessels that seemed perfectly seaworthy in calm weather could come apart like puzzle boxes when subjected to the forces generated by serious storm conditions. Crews that worked efficiently during routine sailing might panic and make fatal errors when faced with weather that threatened to overwhelm their ship's capabilities. The rain arrives with the subtlety of a medieval siege engine, transforming from gentle drops to a deluge that seems determined to fill the ocean by emptying the entire sky directly onto your ship. Within minutes, everyone on deck is soaked through clothing that was never designed to handle this volume of water, creating a population of maritime refugees who look like they've been personally baptized by an angry sea god. The water isn't just falling from abavites, also coming over the sides as waves grow larger and more aggressive, sending spray across the deck with enough force to knock unprepared passengers off their feet. You learn to time your movements with the ship's motion, rushing across open deck space during brief lulls and finding secure handholds before the next wave sends water cascading over the railings like liquid waterfalls that taste of salt and maritime terror. Your fellow passengers respond to storm conditions with varying degrees of panic and acceptance. The merchant has achieved a level of seasickness that transcends mere physical discomfort and enters the realm of existential crisis, while the pilgrims have intensified their prayers to include specific requests for divine intervention in atmospheric management. The experienced traveler offers encouraging commentary like, "This isn't even a real storm yet," and "Wait until you see what happens when it gets dark," and "Try not to think about how deep the water is under us." The ship's motion during storm conditions creates a physical experience that challenges every assumption you've made about the relationship between solid objects and gravity. The deck tilts at angles that make walking impossible and crawling challenging, while the constant acceleration and deceleration in multiple directions simultaneously creates a sensation like being inside a paint mixer operated by someone experimenting with chaos theory. Medieval sailors developed techniques for moving around ships during storm conditions that required strength, balance, and timing skills that would impress modern athletes. They learned to work while essentially hanging from rigging, to time their movements with wave patterns, and to maintain their position using whatever handholds were available while performing tasks that required both hands free. The livestock on deck remember that philosophical goat from earlier? Handle storm conditions with varying degrees of success. The chickens in their coops look profoundly disturbed by their maritime situation and seem to be reconsidering their life choices, while the goat maintains its casual attitude toward the entire voyage with the stoic acceptance of an animal that's probably seen worse weather on land. The goat's ability to maintain its footing during conditions that challenge human passengers suggests either superior balance or complete resignation to whatever fate has in store. Lightning begins adding visual effects to the storm's audio presentation, creating a light show that illuminates the chaos with dramatic timing that would be impressive if you weren't currently living through it. The flashes reveal waves that look impossibly large and ship rigging that's bending in directions that suggest serious conversations between the equipment and the laws of physics. Thunder follows with the sound of celestial artillery, creating an acoustic environment that makes shouted communication nearly impossible. Medieval sailors had no understanding of electrical storms beyond the knowledge that lightning could set ships on fire, kill crew members, or damage equipment in ways that might make the vessel unseaworthy. They developed various superstitions and protective rituals around lightning, but their primary storm management strategy was essentially try not to get hit by anything that's glowing and pray that the ship holds together. The ship's hull begins making new sounds during storm condition squeaks, groans, and occasional alarming cracks that suggest ongoing negotiations between the vessel's structural integrity and the ocean's determination to test it. Medieval ships were built to flex with wave action rather than fight against it, but the sounds of wood under stress create an audio environment that makes you acutely aware of exactly how thin the barrier is between you and several miles of very cold water. Working in storm conditions requires you to develop new relationships with fear, exhaustion, and the concept of personal safety. Every task becomes potentially life-threatening, every movement requires careful planning, and every moment brings new opportunities to discover creative ways that maritime equipment can malfunction under stress. You learn to work while genuinely terrified, to maintain your grip on ropes while your hands are numb from cold and stress, and to follow orders that sound like they were designed by someone who's never actually been on a ship. The galley operations have been suspended because cooking during storm conditions would require skills that go beyond normal culinary training and enter the realm of maritime acrobatics. The cook has secured his equipment and ingredients as best he can, but meals during storms typically consist of whatever cold food passengers can manage to consume while being thrown around like contents of a shipping container in an earthquake. Medieval storm meals were usually hardtack and whatever liquid hadn't been contaminated with seawater, consumed by people who were too seasick to care about flavor and too frightened to worry about nutrition. Eating during storms became an exercise in timing, balance, and the ability to keep food down while your inner ear was convinced that gravity had been replaced with a random number generator. As the storm intensifies, you realize that this weather represents a fundamental test of medieval maritime technology, crew competence, and passenger survival skills. Every rope, sail, and structural element of the ship is being subjected to stresses that reveal whether the vessel was properly built and maintained. Every crew member's training and experience is being tested under conditions that don't allow for mistakes or hesitation. The psychological impact of storm conditions goes beyond simple fear of drowning or injury. Being trapped on a small wooden platform in the middle of an ocean during weather that could destroy much larger structures creates a sense of vulnerability that challenges your fundamental assumptions about human safety and control. Medieval passengers had to cope with the realization that their survival depended entirely on factors beyond their influence: weather patterns, ship construction, and crew competence that they had no ability to evaluate or control. You find yourself gripping whatever solid objects you can reach with strength you didn't know you possessed, while trying to help with storm management tasks that require coordination between multiple people who can barely communicate over the wind and rain. The experienced sailors work with desperate efficiency, their movements suggesting people who understand that everyone's survival depends on their ability to keep the ship functional under conditions that are testing its design limits. The storm continues to intensify as evening approaches, creating the disturbing realization that you'll be dealing with these conditions in darkness, when visibility drops to essentially zero and every task becomes exponentially more dangerous. Medieval sailors had no electric lights, radar, or communication systems. They navigated storms using lanterns that barely provided enough light to see rope work, and they coordinated activities through shouted commands that had to compete with wind and thunder. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we've been mentioning? Right about now, ancient Egyptian beauty treatments are looking like the pinnacle of luxury and safety compared to medieval storm management. At least the Egyptians were trying to solve problems while staying on dry land, while you're currently trying to survive weather that could kill you in several different ways simultaneously while trapped on a wooden box in the middle of an ocean. As you cling to the ship's rigging and watch waves that seem large enough to have their own weather systems rolling toward your vessel, you're beginning to understand why medieval people viewed sea travel as essentially gambling with their lives for the chance of reaching distant destinations. The storm represents everything that could go wrong with maritime travel compressed into one terrifying experience that tests every aspect of ship design, crew training, and passenger endurance. The night ahead promises more of the same weather, but with the added challenge of complete darkness and the growing fatigue of crew members who are already operating at the limits of their physical capabilities. Medieval storm management was essentially a marathon endurance test performed by people who had no choice but to keep working until either the weather improved or the ship failed, and failure meant death for everyone aboard. As night falls and the storm reaches its full medieval fury, you discover that darkness transforms an already terrifying situation into something that would give seasoned horror writers nightmares. The ship's lanterns provide about as much illumination as birthday candles in a hurricane, creating tiny pools of flickering light that make the surrounding darkness seem even more absolute and threatening. Medieval maritime lighting technology was based on the revolutionary principle that oil-soaked wicks in metal containers could theoretically produce light, assuming the oil didn't run out, the wind didn't blow out the flames, and the entire system didn't get washed overboard by the next wave. Navigation in these conditions becomes an exercise in educated guesswork combined with prayer and whatever supernatural intervention the captain can negotiate with maritime deities he's not entirely sure exist. The ship's compass, a magnetized needle floating in a bowl of oil, spins wildly as the vessel pitches and rolls, providing directional information that's about as reliable as asking directions from a drunk philosopher. Medieval navigation was essentially the art of getting lost in a systematic way while hoping that your destination would eventually appear on the horizon. The captain has retreated to his navigation area, which consists of a small table where he studies charts that look like they were drawn by someone who'd heard about coastlines secondhand and decided to fill in the gaps with artistic interpretation. These medieval maps feature detailed illustrations of sea monsters in areas where the cartographer ran out of actual geographical knowledge, which is either charmingly decorative or deeply disturbing depending on whether you believe the monsters are purely symbolic or represent something the mapmakers actually expected to encounter. Medieval cartography was based on the principle that any information was better than no information, even if that information was completely wrong. Ship captains worked with charts that combined accurate coastal observations with wild speculation about distant lands, creating navigation aids that were part geography and part fantasy literature. The fact that anyone successfully reached their intended destinations using these maps represents either remarkable luck or divine intervention in medieval maritime affairs. Historians still argue whether medieval navigators genuinely believed their charts were accurate, or if they simply used them as starting points for navigation techniques that relied heavily on experience, intuition, and the ability to recognize landmarks they'd seen before. What we know for certain is that medieval navigation produced results that were impressive given the technology available, even if the methods would terrify modern maritime professionals. The crew's storm management during nighttime conditions requires them to work essentially blind, identifying problems by sound, touch, and whatever limited visual information they can gather from lanterns that provide roughly the illumination of modern nightlights. They've developed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose ship problems in darkness, recognizing different types of trouble by the sounds the vessel makes as it fights against weather that's trying to tear it apart. You learn to work by feel rather than sight, identifying ropes by their thickness and position, recognizing different parts of the ship by touch, and navigating the deck by memory while trying not to walk into equipment that could seriously injure you or fall overboard into water that would kill you before you could shout for help. Medieval sailors developed sensory skills that compensated for the lack of artificial lighting, but these skills took years to master and required constant attention to avoid fatal mistakes. The sounds of the storm at night create an audio environment that would challenge a professional sound designer working on a disaster movie. Beyond the constant howl of wind and crash of waves, There are the grinding sounds of wood under stress, the snap and crack of rigging reaching its limits, and the occasional alarming crashes that suggest important parts of the ship are either breaking or considering it seriously. You learn to identify different types of maritime distress by sound alone, distinguishing between normal storm noise and something important just broke and we might all die. Your fellow passengers have found whatever shelter they can manage below deck, where the motion is even more violent but the exposure to wind and rain is reduced to merely miserable rather than potentially lethal. The merchant has achieved a level of seasickness that transcends physical discomfort and enters the realm of philosophical crisis about the nature of existence. His complaints have evolved from specific grievances about ship conditions to general questions about why humans ever thought ocean travel was a reasonable idea. The pilgrims have organized a continuous prayer rotation that covers various saints, deities, and supernatural entities who might have some influence over weather conditions and ship survival. Their theological approach to storm management includes specific requests for divine intervention in maritime affairs, combined with promises of future good behavior that suggest they're prepared to negotiate their way out of this situation through spiritual diplomacy. Medieval religious beliefs included detailed hierarchies of saints who specialized in different aspects of maritime protection, creating a spiritual insurance system where travelers could appeal to multiple divine authorities for assistance with specific problems. Ships often carried religious relics and icons that were believed to provide supernatural protection during dangerous weather, though the effectiveness of these spiritual aids was difficult to measure given that survivors tended to credit divine intervention while victims were unavailable for comment. The experienced traveler has found a relatively secure position where he can ride out the storm while offering commentary on the situation that ranges from genuinely helpful advice to observations that make everyone more anxious about their survival prospects. His storm weather expertise includes detailed knowledge about which parts of the ship are most likely to survive severe weather and which areas passengers should avoid if they want to remain alive until morning. Navigation during medieval storms was essentially impossible using conventional techniques, so captains relied on dead reckoning estimating position based on previous course, speed, and time elapsed combined with whatever environmental clues they could observe. This created situations where ships could be hundreds of miles off course without anyone realizing it until they either spotted familiar landmarks or ran into something solid like coastlines or other vessels. The ship's movement in heavy seas becomes so violent that normal activities like eating, sleeping, or even remaining in one place require constant physical effort and careful timing. You learn to move in coordination with the ship's motion, timing every action to coincide with brief moments of relative stability while preparing for the next period of chaos. Medieval passengers developed sea legs through necessity rather than choice, adapting to conditions that challenged every aspect of human balance and coordination. Working on deck during night storms requires crew members to essentially conduct complex maritime operations while blindfolded and being thrown around by forces that could easily kill them. They coordinate their efforts through shouted commands and predetermined hand signals, though both communication methods are severely compromised by wind, rain, and the general chaos of trying to manage a ship in conditions that are testing its design limits. The rigging work continues throughout the night because storm damage requires immediate repair regardless of visibility or crew fatigue. Medieval sailors had to fix broken equipment and adjust sails in complete darkness while being soaked by freezing rain and buffeted by winds that could knock them overboard without warning. Their repair techniques relied on muscle memory, tactile identification of equipment, and the ability to work effectively while genuinely terrified. Medieval storms tested not just the physical capabilities of ships and crews, but also their psychological endurance. Being trapped on a small wooden platform surrounded by hostile weather that could destroy the vessel without warning created stress levels that modern psychology would classify as extreme trauma. Crew members and passengers had to function effectively while dealing with exhaustion, fear, and the constant awareness that their survival depended on factors completely beyond their control. The ship's food and water supplies face additional challenges during storm conditions, as containers that seemed secure in calm weather prove inadequate when subjected to the violent motion of heavy seas. Water barrels shift and leak, creating freshwater shortages that compound the existing problems with water quality. Food stores suffer damage from seawater infiltration and the general chaos of equipment breaking loose from its moorings during extreme weather. You discover that medieval maritime emergency procedures were essentially improvisational exercises performed by people who understood that conventional solutions might not work under extraordinary circumstances. Storm management required crews to adapt their techniques in real time, using whatever materials and equipment remained functional while dealing with problems that their training had covered only in theory. The psychological impact of surviving a medieval storm extends beyond the immediate experience of danger and discomfort. Passengers and crew members who lived through severe weather often developed permanent changes in their relationship with ocean travel, ranging from increased confidence in their ability to survive maritime disasters to complete terror at the thought of ever boarding another ship. As dawn finally begins to break, and you only recognize this because the absolute blackness gradually lightens to dark gray, the storm shows signs of beginning to exhaust itself, though it's still producing weather that would challenge modern vessels with advanced technology and professional crews. The gradual increase in visibility reveals the full extent of storm damage to the ship's equipment and the toll that night-long emergency operations have taken on passengers and crew. The deck is littered with debris that represents everything from broken equipment to pieces of the ship itself that decided to part company with the main vessel during the most violent weather. Crew members begin assessing damage with the systematic approach of people who understand that survival requires immediate repairs to whatever broke during the night. Their damage reports include technical assessments like, the main mast is still attached and most of the sails are still there, and we're not sinking any faster than usual. Medieval storm recovery was essentially a triage operation where crews prioritized repairs based on what was most likely to kill everyone if left unfixed. Ships that survived severe weather often limped to their destinations with improvised repairs and jury-rigged equipment that would have failed safety inspections in any reasonable maritime authority, but which kept the vessels functional long enough to reach port. Your own condition after surviving a medieval night storm includes physical exhaustion that goes beyond simple tiredness and enters the realm of complete muscular breakdown, combined with a psychological state that suggests you've been personally introduced to forces of nature that shouldn't be possible on the same planet as human civilization. Your hands are beyond Roth-EVE achieved a state where pain receptors have apparently given up reporting the damage because there's too much to catalog. The other survivors emerge from whatever shelter they found with expressions that suggest they've undergone spiritual experiences, though not necessarily pleasant ones. The merchant looks like he's been personally betrayed by the concept of commerce. The pilgrims appear to have achieved new levels of religious devotion through terror, and the experienced traveler maintains his philosophical acceptance of maritime hardship while quietly assessing whether the ship is likely to hold together long enough to reach the next port. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we keep referencing? After surviving a medieval storm at sea, ancient Egyptian beauty treatments are looking like the pinnacle of civilized luxury. At least the Egyptians were dealing with cosmetic problems while standing on solid ground, rather than fighting for survival in weather that seemed personally designed to test the limits of human endurance while trapped on a wooden box in the middle of an endless ocean. As the storm finally begins to subside and you take stock of your survival, you realize that medieval maritime travel represented one of humanity's most ambitious attempts to work with natural forces that were completely beyond human control. Every voyage was essentially a gamble with weather patterns, navigation accuracy, and ship construction quality, performed by people who had no choice but to trust their lives to technology and knowledge that were still being developed through trial and error. The morning after the storm brings the promise of calmer weather and the disturbing realization that this was considered normal medieval maritime experience rather than an extraordinary disaster. Ships that survived weather like this were expected to continue their voyages. Crews were expected to resume regular duties, and passengers were expected to accept storm conditions as part of the adventure they'd signed up for when they decided to travel by sea. After what feels like an eternity of being personally tormented by the ocean and tested by weather that seemed designed by someone with a grudge against human survival, land finally appears on the horizon like a mirage that might actually be real. The lookout's cry of "Land ho!" creates the first genuinely positive emotion you've experienced since this maritime nightmare began. Though after weeks of medieval ship life, you're not entirely convinced that what you're seeing isn't just a hallucination brought on by hardtack poisoning and chronic sleep deprivation. The approaching coastline looks impossibly solid and reassuringly stationary compared to the constantly moving wooden prison you've called home for longer than your psychological stability can properly calculate. Medieval harbors weren't exactly modern ports. They were basically places where ships could get close enough to land for people to jump off and kiss the ground while promising never to voluntarily board another vessel. But compared to your current floating situation, they represent the pinnacle of human achievement and divine mercy. The crew's excitement about reaching port creates the first genuinely cheerful atmosphere you've witnessed since leaving your departure harbor, which now seems like it existed in a previous lifetime when you were a different person who hadn't yet learned what weevil-infested hardtack tastes like or developed the ability to sleep while being thrown around by maritime forces that treat human comfort as an amusing theoretical concept. Your fellow passengers emerge from whatever survival strategies they've developed during the voyage, looking like refugees from a disaster that hasn't officially been declared over yet. The merchant has lost enough weight to suggest that medieval maritime cuisine functions as an extremely effective diet plan, though not one that anyone would voluntarily choose. His clothes hang on him like they were tailored for someone significantly larger, and his expression suggests he's reconsidering his entire approach to international commerce. The pilgrims appear to have achieved the spiritual transformation they were seeking, though probably not through the methods they originally intended. Their prayers have evolved from general requests for divine blessing to very specific negotiations about survival, and their faces suggest they've had religious experiences that involved more terror and less enlightenment than traditional pilgrimage literature usually describes. Their relationship with divine providence has been tested under conditions that would challenge the faith of professional saints. The experienced traveler maintains his philosophical acceptance of maritime hardship while quietly calculating whether he's survived enough sea voyages to consider retiring to a nice landlocked profession that doesn't involve trusting his life to medieval shipbuilding and navigation techniques. His maritime expertise has been thoroughly validated by the voyage, but his enthusiasm for continued ocean travel seems to have been somewhat diminished by recent experience. Medieval ports were essentially controlled chaos where ships arrived in whatever condition they could manage, discharged their human and material cargo as quickly as possible, and began preparing for the next voyage before passengers could fully process the trauma of the previous one. These harbors functioned as maritime rehabilitation centers where survivors of ocean travel could recover their land legs and try to convince themselves that the experience hadn't permanently damaged their relationship with transportation. As your ship limps toward the harbor, and limping is the appropriate term for a vessel that's held together by repairs made during storms using whatever materials happen to be available at the time, you can see other ships in various stages of maritime distress and recovery. Some vessels look like they've survived experiences similar to yours, while others appear to have encountered weather or navigation challenges that make your voyage look like a pleasure cruise. The harbor itself is a mixture of legitimate maritime commerce and controlled disaster management, with dock workers who've developed the specialized skills needed to handle ships that arrive in conditions ranging from slightly damaged to floating by divine intervention alone. These port professionals have seen every possible combination of storm damage, navigation error, and crew incompetence that medieval maritime travel could produce. Historians still argue whether medieval port workers genuinely enjoyed their jobs, or if they simply accepted harbor work as preferable to the alternatives of sea travel or medieval agricultural labor. What we know for certain is that medieval ports developed surprisingly efficient systems for managing the constant flow of vessels that arrived in various states of distress, carrying passengers and crews who needed immediate medical attention, psychological support, and access to food that didn't require archaeological excavation to identify. The process of actually reaching the dock requires navigation skills that challenge even experienced captains, because medieval harbors were designed by people who understood that ships needed places to land, but who hadn't necessarily worked out all the technical details of how to accomplish this safely. Your captain approaches the docking process with the focused intensity of someone attempting a precision maneuver using equipment that was never designed for precision work. The docking procedure involves crew members throwing ropes to shore workers with the accuracy of people whose lives depend on successful completion of this particular task. Because their lives actually do depend on successful completion of this particular task. Medieval docking was essentially a group athletic event performed by people who were already exhausted from managing ships through conditions that tested their physical and psychological limits. As the ship finally makes contact with the dock process that involves more crashing and grinding sounds than you'd expect from a successful maritime operation, you feel the first solid, stationary surface you've experienced since leaving your departure port. The sensation of being connected to land, even indirectly through the ship, creates an emotional response that surprises you with its intensity. The dock doesn't move with wave action, it doesn't tilt at impossible angles, and it provides a connection to Earth that represents stability, safety, and the possibility of escape from maritime life. The disembarkation process reveals that medieval ports had developed efficient systems for managing passengers who were in various stages of physical and psychological recovery from sea travel. Port workers help people who've forgotten how to walk on stationary surfaces, while local merchants offer services ranging from basic medical care to spiritual counseling for travelers who've had religious experiences involving storms, navigation errors, and medieval maritime cuisine. Your first steps on solid ground create a physical sensation that challenges your brain's understanding of how surfaces are supposed to behave. After weeks of constant motion, stationary ground feels strange and slightly untrustworthy, as if it might suddenly start pitching and rolling like the ship deck you've become accustomed to. Medieval travelers often experienced land sickness after sea voyages, requiring time to readjust to environments that didn't move in coordination with weather patterns. The local food situation represents the first genuinely positive aspect of medieval life you've encountered since beginning this maritime adventure. Even basic medieval port cuisine, bread that doesn't require soaking to become edible, water that hasn't developed its own ecosystem, and food that doesn't contain surprise protein in the form of insects seems like luxury dining after weeks of ship provisions that tested the boundaries of human nutritional tolerance. Your digestive system, which has adapted to maritime cuisine through a combination of resignation and survival instinct, responds to actual food with enthusiasm that borders on religious devotion. Fresh bread tastes like it was created by culinary artists. Clean water seems like a miracle of medieval engineering, and even simple port tavern meals represent a level of gastronomic sophistication that makes you question why humans ever thought improving on basic nutrition was necessary. Medieval ports developed specialized services for maritime travelers who needed time to recover from sea voyages before continuing their journeys or returning to normal life. These services included medical care for injuries and illnesses common to ship travel, temporary housing for people who needed to readjust to land-based living, and employment opportunities for travelers who decided that their maritime careers should end immediately. The psychological recovery from medieval sea travel involved processing experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about human safety, comfort, and the relationship between civilization and natural forces. Many medieval travelers reported permanent changes in their worldview after surviving ocean voyages, ranging from increased appreciation for simple pleasures to complete terror at the thought of any transportation more complex than walking. The merchant begins calculating whether his cargo survived the voyage in condition that might produce profits sufficient to justify the experience, though his accounting methods suggest that he's including psychological trauma and physical suffering as business expenses that should be factored into future commercial decisions. His entrepreneurial enthusiasm has been somewhat dampened by practical experience with the realities of medieval maritime commerce. The pilgrims assess their spiritual journey with the satisfaction of people who achieved their religious goals through methods that were more dramatic and terrifying than they anticipated, but which produced genuine transformation through adversity. Their pilgrimage has included experiences that most religious literature only hints at, and their faith has been tested under conditions that would challenge professional theologians. As you stand on the dock, feeling solid ground beneath your feet and breathing air that doesn't taste like salt, fear, and maritime desperation, you begin to process the full scope of what you've survived. Medieval sea travel represented one of humanity's most ambitious attempts to work with natural forces that were completely beyond human control, using technology that was still being developed and navigation techniques that were essentially educated guesswork combined with prayer and luck. The experience has taught you to appreciate simple pleasures that modern life takes for granted: stationary surfaces, reliable food supplies, bathroom facilities that don't require risking your life to use, and sleeping arrangements that don't involve sharing space with rodents who have better maritime skills than you do. Medieval ship travel was essentially a crash course in human adaptability and the limits of comfort that people could endure when survival required accepting conditions that challenged every aspect of civilized living. Your hands, which began the voyage as recognizably human appendages, now look like they've been personally introduced to every aspect of medieval maritime labor and found wanting. They're covered in scars, calluses, and healing wounds that tell the story of rope work, storm management, and general ship operations performed under conditions that would violate numerous safety regulations in any reasonable society. The other survivors from your ship are experiencing their own versions of maritime recovery, ranging from quiet gratitude for survival to loud promises never to voluntarily board another vessel for the rest of their natural lives. Medieval sea travel created bonds between passengers and crew members who shared experiences that land-based civilization couldn't fully understand or appreciate, forming communities of people who'd survived something that most of their contemporaries would find unbelievable. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we've been mentioning throughout this journey? After surviving medieval maritime travel, ancient Egyptian beauty treatments represent the absolute pinnacle of civilized luxury and sophisticated technology. The Egyptians were working on cosmetic improvements while standing on solid ground and using ingredients that were merely unusual rather than potentially lethal, which seems incredibly reasonable compared to the medieval approach to ocean travel. As evening approaches and you settle into your first night of sleep on land since beginning this voyage, you realize that medieval maritime travel was essentially a form of voluntary adversity that people accepted because the alternative, staying home and missing opportunities for commerce, pilgrimage, or adventure, seemed worse than risking death by ocean. Every successful voyage represented a victory over natural forces that had unlimited power to destroy human efforts to cross large bodies of water in wooden boxes. The bed in your port inn doesn't move with wave action, doesn't require grip strength to remain in, and doesn't include roommates with more legs than you have. These features, which would seem basic and unremarkable under normal circumstances, now represent the height of luxury accommodation after weeks of maritime sleeping arrangements that challenged every aspect of human rest and recovery. Your dreams that night are filled with the sounds, sensations, and experiences of ship life: the constant creaking of wood under stress, the motion of waves lifting and dropping the vessel, the taste of hardtack and the smell of unwashed humanity in confined spaces. Medieval sea travel left permanent impressions on survivors' memories, creating experiences that influenced their perspectives on risk, comfort, and the relationship between human civilization and natural forces for the rest of their lives. As you drift into sleep on a surface that stays exactly where you put it, surrounded by air that smells of land rather than ocean, you understand why medieval people viewed successful sea voyages as achievements worth celebrating, and why they often made religious offerings in gratitude for survival. The ocean had tested every aspect of your physical capabilities, psychological endurance, and faith in human technology, and somehow through a combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention that you're not qualified to analyze, you survived to tell the tale. The medieval maritime experience has ended, but its lessons about human adaptability, the limits of technology, and the importance of appreciating simple pleasures will stay with you forever. You'll never again complain about modern transportation, food quality, or accommodation standards without remembering weevil-infested hardtack, hammocks shared with rodents, and bathroom facilities that required risking your life to use. And as sleep finally claims you on solid, stationary ground, surrounded by the luxury of not being in constant danger of drowning, you can rest in the knowledge that you've survived something that most people throughout history could never imagine attempting. Medieval sea travel was humanity's bold experiment in working with forces beyond human control, and you lived to reach the other side scarred, exhausted, and permanently changed, but triumphantly, undeniably alive. Now, as our journey together comes to an end, let yourself sink deeper into your comfortable bed, knowing that your pillow won't try to escape in the night, your walls won't creak and groan with the sound of wood under stress, and your morning will begin with food that doesn't require archaeological excavation to identify. Feel the solid ground beneath your building, unchanging and reliable, supporting your rest with the kind of stability that medieval travelers could only dream about during their nights at sea. The sounds outside your window are the gentle sounds of civilization, not the howling wind through rigging or the crash of waves against wooden hulls, but the peaceful sounds of a world where transportation doesn't require risking your life and where bathroom facilities are conveniently located and structurally sound. Let these comforting sounds carry you into sleep, knowing that your greatest adventure tonight is the simple luxury of resting without fear, surrounded by the marvels of modern life that make every day easier than the best day aboard a medieval ship. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow you'll wake up exactly where you went to sleep, in a world where food comes without surprise protein, where water is clean and plentiful, and where travel is something you do for pleasure rather than survival. Sweet dreams of solid ground and modern comfort, and gratitude for living in an age where crossing oceans is routine rather than miraculous.